Hello there, it's Mr. Hefner again, and we're just going to take a quick introduction to the Gettysburg Address. Actually, this presentation is more than an introduction. The speech is so short that I've actually embedded it right here in the presentation. So if you stay with me through the entire video, we'll have covered the speech and you won't have to go read that separately unless you want to refer to it for some of the questions. All right, as I said, our topic today is going to be the Gettysburg Address. It's probably one of, if not the most famous speeches in all of American history. And our lesson essential question today is going to be what characteristics make this one of the most important speeches in all of American history. As you know, speeches have to be composed slightly differently than something like an essay would be. In an essay, I can have complicated ideas and long sentences, and my reader can stop and go back over them and think about them. In a speech, the speech goes on. And so if something needs to be, kind of a point needs to be driven home, we need to emphasize, we need to repeat. And so we're going to look at the techniques that Abraham Lincoln uses in this most famous of all American speeches. Now I'm going to go through this really quickly because it's not absolutely key to understanding the speech itself. But the Battle of Gettysburg took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is just about 90 miles away from Conrad Weiser High School. And if you've never been there, you definitely should go and tour it sometime. It's an absolutely beautiful national park these days. Here's a map that I have for you of Gettysburg as it was at the time of the battle. And you might notice all these roads from different directions that all converge on that town, that little tiny town of fewer than about 2,000 people who were living there at the time. I guess for where it was located in central Pennsylvania, it was a pretty good sized town, but by today's standards, it was a really small town. So why would a battle happen there? Well, it turns out that for the last month, Robert E. Lee has had his army in Pennsylvania. They're actually scattered all over the state. And what they're doing is they're foraging. They're looking for sheep and goats and pigs and horses and money and corn and wheat and vegetables and pretty much any kind of supplies that they can take with them should they have to go back into Virginia. At the same time, Robert E. Lee and the Union Army noticed these roads that converge at Gettysburg, and small elements of both armies met in that little town. When it became apparent that there was going to be a battle here, both armies used all of these roads to find a place where they could converge together. And so both armies are coming together in this tiny little town of Gettysburg. On the first day of the battle, July 1st, the fighting takes place northwest of town. The Confederates are coming in from the west and later from the north, and the Union troops are slowly coming in from the south. They were down in Maryland, not too far away, digging in, hoping to fight a battle on their own land, but instead they're coming up here. And so the fighting is going to happen northwest of Gettysburg. For the first part of the day, the Union Army wins the battle, but as the day moves on, Confederate troops arrive from the north. The Confederates far outnumber the Union troops, and the Union troops are forced to flee through town and go south of town. And this is where they're going to fight for the next 2 days of the battle, July 2nd and July 3rd. Robert E. Lee's strategy for July 2nd was to attack the flanks or the ends of the Union line. Now, I'm not completely sure you can see my cursor here, but there is sort of a dark area here that looks like an upside-down fishhook or a backwards question mark. That is actually two lines. It's the Confederates on the outside, the Union on the inside. And what's going to happen on that second day is Robert E. Lee is going to try to get around the Union Army by attacking on the ends. If he can get his army around the Union Army, he literally places it between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., and that could have possibly forced surrender terms from the North. He's unsuccessful that day, and by the end of the day, both armies are pretty much in the same positions they were when they started the day. On the third day of the battle, Robert E. Lee is going to try a new strategy. He's going to move his army directly across the field, and he's going to attack right in the middle of the Union line. He believes he weakened that yesterday by drawing troops to the end, to the flanks. This is where a grand assault, sometimes called Pickett's Charge, occurs, and that's going to result in 7,000 Confederates being shot down in a mere 30 minutes of that day. At the end of that day, both armies are still holding their position. They both suffered incredible casualties, 51,000 casualties in all. And by July 4th, Robert E. Lee is going to pull his army out of Gettysburg and begin the march back to Virginia. Now, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln. Every elementary school child can tell you something about Abraham Lincoln. The legends and the folklore that surround him are probably as big as the history, if not bigger. During his lifetime, Abraham Lincoln had a number of nicknames. He was known as the rail splitter because he grew up on the frontier and he could take his axe and split logs into long rails, which were commonly used to make various types of fences for farmland in those days. His reputation for honesty was such that he got the nickname Honest Abe. He's the guy who wrote and signed the Emancipation Proclamation and pushed the 13th Amendment through Congress. So he gets the nickname the Great Emancipator. And many of those slaves who were ultimately freed by him referred to him as Father Abraham. Like I said, he was born in the backwoods. He was born in a cabin in Kentucky. And his mother died when he was very young. His mother died of something called milk poisoning. That used to occur when cows would graze on the prairie and eat something that was poisonous. And those toxins they would literally build up in the milk. And when people drank the milk, they drank the poisons. And she became sick and she died. But his father remarried. Abraham Lincoln had a number of jobs, as everyone did back in those days. He worked for a while as a flatboatman. Basically, it's kind of like a truck driver today. He would take a raft. It had no means of self-propulsion, but you would load it up with goods and then guide it downstream to deliver those products. He worked as a storekeeper for a while, a postmaster, a surveyor, but it was when he trained himself to become a lawyer that he really changed his life. Abraham Lincoln is what you call an autodidact, someone who taught himself. And he read the law books, he read the law cases, and then eventually he ran for Congress and served a time in the U.S. House of Representatives. When the Black Hawk War, the Black Hawk Indian tribe and the United States fought for a while, Abraham Lincoln joined a company and he was elected the captain. He didn't see any action, did no fighting, but technically I suppose he had military experience because of that. His first love was a woman named Anne Rutledge, and when she died, while he was still deeply in love with her and younger than she, he was plunged into what we believe was his first truly deep period of depression. Abraham Lincoln was known for the opposites of his emotions. He had periods of deep depression, almost debilitating, and his humor. And many times people deal with the darkest parts of their life by finding ways to laugh about it. And Abraham Lincoln had a very, very keen sense of humor. He later married Mary Todd, and she's known today as Mary Todd Lincoln. She comes from a Southern family. In fact, everyone else in her family remained Confederates while she was married to the President of the United States. There's a funny story that Mary Todd used to tell. She said she was at a ball one time when Abraham Lincoln walked up to her and he said, "I have been wanting to dance with you in the worst way." And she went on to say that that's exactly what he did. Evidently, Abraham Lincoln wasn't a very good dancer, in her eyes anyway. Now, many of you have heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas in a series of debates while they were both running for the same Senate seat. Abraham Lincoln lost that race to Douglas, but because of his speeches in that race, in that series of debates, he was kind of like noticed by the new Republican Party. And later, when they needed a candidate to run for president, they picked Abraham Lincoln. If Abraham Lincoln had beaten Stephen Douglas in that election and won the Senate seat, he may have never been president of the United States. Throughout his term as president, Abraham Lincoln struggled. I don't like the word struggled, actually. Abraham Lincoln grew in his positions on slavery. At the start of his presidency, he famously said that if he could keep the nation together by keeping slavery, he would do that. And if he could keep the nation together by getting rid of slavery, he would do that. And if he could keep the nation together by keeping slavery in some places and getting rid of it in others, he would do that. But he evolved, and by the time Abraham Lincoln finished his 4 years, getting rid of slavery in this country had become his number one goal. And that's evident in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is the amendment that ended and now forbids slavery in this country. And everybody knows the story of Abraham Lincoln's assassination up to a point. Most people can tell you that a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth snuck into the theater and put a bullet in the back of the head of the President of the United States. What a lot of people don't realize is that was just one part of a big conspiracy to literally decapitate the Union government. That same night, accomplices of John Wilkes Booth were also trying to assassinate the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of State. Now, the speech that Abraham Lincoln gave was given on November 19th, 1863, so it's a few months after the battle, which was July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The cemetery itself was to be the burial place of Union soldiers only. So it wouldn't have been all 51,000. And number one, 51,000 casualties, just to clear this up, doesn't mean 51,000 deaths. A casualty in terms of battle is someone who was killed, someone who was wounded, or someone who was just simply missing after the battle. But this cemetery was for Union soldiers only. Some mistakes were made, and if you go there today, you'll find there are a handful of Confederates who were buried in the Union cemetery. The idea for the cemetery came from an attorney, a lawyer, who lived in Gettysburg. His name was David Wills. And you think about this little town. This tiny little town of people has served as a hospital. There are more dead people now in the town of Gettysburg than there are living. And they needed to do something, and he came up with the idea for our first national cemetery. The featured speaker was going to be a man named Edward Everett. He was renowned as an orator. This man could speak, and breathe fire as he did so. And he spoke for several hours at Gettysburg before Abraham Lincoln gave up and gave his less than 3-minute long speech. But Lincoln was simply invited as an afterthought. He was invited to make a few remarks, not to give a speech, which is perhaps why his speech is so short. Now, Abraham Lincoln's speech wasn't received well at first. It was very short. It wasn't what people expected in a speech, and newspaper reporters wrote it down as quickly as they could and then commented on it. And if you look at newspaper accounts close to the speech, they're pretty negative. But as time went on, and people had a chance to read the revised copies of the speech and reread it and think about it, it grew into the famous speech that we have today. And there are some silly legends about the Gettysburg Address. One of them says that Abraham Lincoln quickly wrote it down on the back of an envelope while he was on the train ride from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg. Anybody who looks at Lincoln's speeches from the day he went to Washington until the Battle of Gettysburg and his Gettysburg Address in November of that year, you can hear that Lincoln had been playing around with these ideas. And so he had tested these ideas out in other speeches, in his writing, and clearly he's been working on it in his head. Is it possible that he put some finishing touches on it that night? Absolutely. He stayed that night, by the way, in David Wills' house in Gettysburg. So this is a picture of the Wills house in Gettysburg. And again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these windows right here are at the window of the bedroom where Abraham Lincoln would have stayed. Down below, this is a cast iron painted statue of Abraham Lincoln and a young man looking up at that window as if Abraham Lincoln is pointing the room out himself. But Abraham Lincoln stayed there in that room. He may have put the finishing touches on that speech. And today this building's owned by the National Park Service. It's a museum. You can go in and tour each floor of the building. It works as a museum. And then you can go into Abraham Lincoln's the guest room where Abraham Lincoln stayed. And interestingly enough, the coverlet that's on the bed is the very same one that was on the bed the night that Abraham Lincoln slept there. Now, there already was a cemetery in Gettysburg before and during the battle. This is the gatehouse to what was known as Evergreen Cemetery. It's still there today. It was a civilian cemetery, and it's on a hill. Because it was a hill, it became important ground for fighting. It was known as Cemetery Hill. And the National Cemetery shares a border with this cemetery that was originally there. We don't have that many pictures of what went on that day. This is Baltimore Street, one of the two main streets in Gettysburg, and the crowd coming down the street heading towards the cemetery for the dedication. Possibly Abraham Lincoln is in that crowd somewhere. It's said that he rode a horse during this procession. This is the only picture we actually have of Abraham Lincoln on the hill as the cemetery is being dedicated. So you see the crowd and the dignitaries on the hill. And if we really zoom in, if you look in that red square that's there and we blow that red square up, you'll see there's Abraham Lincoln. He's not holding still. He's not posing. He's not wearing his famous stovepipe hat because he's already taken it off. This picture was taken just after the speech was over. It took so long in those days to get a camera set up to take a photograph that by the time Lincoln finished his very short speech, the photographer had already missed the chance to take a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Now we're going to take a look at two literary tools in this presentation. We're going to be looking at antithesis. You already know that anti means against or opposite, and thesis means an idea, often a central idea. So what we're going to look at in this speech is how does Abraham Lincoln take two opposite ideas and put them together creatively to make a point. And again, if you can see my cursor here, this is a short excerpt from the speech. It says, as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. The antithesis here is the difference between dying and living. The soldiers died so that the nation can live. That's antithesis. And then there's parallelism. And we've talked about this a number of times throughout the course. Parallelism can be used in writing and in speaking. And it occurs when you want to express several ideas, and so you put them all in the same grammatical structure for effect. We'll talk about this as we go through the speech. Here's the speech. I'm not going to make you read it in cursive, so don't panic. If you go on the internet, you'll find 5 to 10, maybe even more, versions of the Gettysburg Address. That often happens with old speeches. The speeches were given, and people wrote them down as quickly as they could while they were listening. And so you get different versions. The next day, Abraham Lincoln's two secretaries both produced official copies to be released. John Hay was one of Abraham Lincoln's secretaries, very young man to be serving as secretary to the president, and another fellow by the name of John Nicolay. And the Nicolay version is more famous today, but this is the John Hay version you're seeing on this image. So let's get started with the speech. We'll go through paragraph by paragraph. I'll make a few comments as we go, and then we'll wrap this up with the discussion questions. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Okay, so this first paragraph of the speech introduces the speech, and Lincoln uses this famous line. It's famous today, 87 years ago. We've heard that many times. You have to understand what it means to understand what a score is. So in kind of like Victorian language, a score meant 20. So 80 would be 80, plus 7 years. So 87 years ago, the Declaration of Independence was signed. And that's what Abraham Lincoln is making a reference to. And his question now is, we started a country 87 years ago with the idea that everyone would be equal. That's his setup. So he's going to move into that idea of, can we survive if we believe that? So let's take a look at the second paragraph. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. And so here Lincoln establishes the problem that needs to be addressed. We are in a war right now, and we're in a war testing to see whether nations born in freedom, focused on freedom and equality, can live long. And he says that we're here to dedicate the cemetery to those who died here. And he says it's a fitting thing, it's a proper thing. But now he's going to, in the next paragraph, he's going to contrast that slightly. So let's take a look at paragraph 3. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And so now he contrasts the very reason they're here. He told us in the last paragraph, we're here to dedicate a cemetery. Now he says, we can't. Because to dedicate a cemetery means to make it holy ground, to hallow this ground. And he says that those who died here for the cause, they've already made this holy ground. They've done it. And he says, we're here for something else. But it's kind of ironic. Let's take a look at the antithesis here. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. So the antithesis is contrasting the ideas of remembering and forgetting. People will forget our words, but they will never forget the actions of the soldiers who died here. I guess this paragraph's a little bit ironic today because we certainly do remember the words. We're listening to them and studying them right now. All right, let's go on to the last paragraph of the speech. This is where Abraham Lincoln rams it on home. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now that's the end of the speech, and this is where Abraham Lincoln tells his audience what they must do. He says, you have a job here. You have a job to finish the task, the job, that those who died here, those who fought here, have started. They died to keep this nation alive, to give this nation a new birth of freedom. And what does that mean, a new birth of freedom? Many have interpreted that to mean to give freedom to all of those who are held in slavery today. That would be a new birth of freedom. And then to prove that government of the people, by the people, for the people, think Declaration of Independence here, shall not die. And so it is your job, people, to finish the task, to finish this war, and complete the cause of keeping this nation alive. It's quite a speech. All right, let's go over the check for understanding questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Which of these demonstrates parallelism? Parallelism means expressing several points all using the same grammatical structure. It's D. Now forget about the first part. The parallel part is of the people, by the people, for the people. 3 prepositional phrases. They start with different prepositions. They all end with the same object, people. But the fact is they all have the same grammatical structure. Which of the following demonstrates antithesis, the idea that we take 2 opposites and put them together to make a point? Yes, we talked about this during the speech, the idea of remembering and forgetting. According to Abraham Lincoln, what is the Civil War testing? That's right. The Civil War is testing whether that nation, born on July 4th, 1776, a nation dedicated to freedom and equality, can survive. And then those here listening to the speech are the living. He says, what is their job? This one's a little tricky. You've got to discriminate carefully as you read these choices. And that's right, to repair the nation, bring the Union back together. Continuing the war may be part of that, but it's not the answer. This one's really simple and maybe should have been the first question. What is the occasion for which this speech was written? Of course, Lincoln is speaking at the dedication of the National Cemetery for the Battle of Gettysburg. What is the last full measure of devotion? This is the thing that the soldiers who died gave. And that's right, it's their life. You can dedicate actions to a cause, but to give your life to a cause is going to be the last and most complete thing you can do. And lastly, this is an old postcard image that I found of the Gettysburg Cemetery. This must have been shortly after the war. The vegetation, if you go there, it's a beautiful cemetery today, but the vegetation today is fully grown, and what looks like shrubs in this picture is really fully grown trees now. The entire cemetery is under a canopy of leaves. And if you ever get a chance to go there on Remembrance Day weekend, that would be the weekend closest to November 19th, at nighttime they put out luminaries. You might have done luminaries at Christmas. It's when you take a paper lunch bag, put some sand in it, put a small candle in there and light it, and they put one luminary at the grave of every soldier buried in that cemetery. It's an absolutely beautiful and really emotional image. And that's it. I thank you again for staying with me through the entire presentation. Be sure to check Schoology. You may have additional assignments to do there, but I appreciate your attention and look forward to seeing you soon in class.